Hello and welcome to our podcast, The Legal Impacts of the Overturning of Roe v. Wade on American Service Members, a Critical Reflection. We will start with introductions and create space for each other to share our stories. I'll kick things off. I am Dr. Amy May, she, her, hers. I'm a professor of communication and the department chair at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, Troth-Yeda, where we live and work on the ancestral lands of the Dene people. I am also a law student, a rising L2 at Cleveland State University College of Law. My research focuses on the social construction of gender in different contexts, including the military. I spent 22 years as a spouse of an Army officer, which not only shaped and framed my lived experiences, but also my research interests as well. As a cohort, we have explored the multi-layered experiences of military-affiliated peoples, and you will learn more about our collaborations as we move forward in the podcast. Since starting law school, my interests have shifted to how the law frames gender as a construct and ultimately how jurisprudence, or the study of the science of law, contributes to social and communicative norms. I am so grateful to be here today with my peers and collaborators, and I'll turn it over to Leah as we continue to get to know each other.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. May. My name's Leandra Hernandez. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Utah, and my pronouns are she, her, ella. So my work utilizes critical, qualitative, and feminist approaches to explore both the cultural causes and impacts of reproductive justice, injustice, and gender violence in contexts such as those related to health communication, media, journalism studies, and also gender studies context. As a military veteran spouse, most of my work in military communication studies context has explored the ways in which military spouses with graduate degrees navigate uncertainty, mental health, and well-being, which is one of the first projects that we collectively worked on. It's also how we met. And also the ways in which we can best support military affiliated learners pedagogically. As Dr. May noted, she has her own relationship to the military. So do I. So does Dr. McDermott. My husband served in the U.S. Navy for 10 years as a supply corps officer, and I was very fortunate during that time to be able to teach almost exclusively military affiliated learners, many of whom were active duty trying to get their college degrees when they were serving full time, deployed in a variety of war zones, and also just trying to make sense of their life. My family also has intergenerational military service starting with the Civil War. So it is a huge part of my family's history. And we're all just so thankful to be here together today to talk about it more with you, and also to think about how we can best support all of our service members and veterans. So with this study, as we are expanding our earlier scholarship on how the overturn of Roe v. Wade has impacted military service members, I'm particularly thinking about how it is an instance of reproductive injustice and also how it impacts service members' health agency as well. So Dr. McDermott, tell us a bit about yourself.
Yes, thank you to my peers and collaborators. I'm Dr. Tori McDermott. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm an assistant professor, the foundational communication course director, and graduate director at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, Troth-Yeda. And I study how power is communicated in traditionally masculine environments, the military being one of those environments. And I'm also a military spouse, now veteran. My husband served 11 years in the Army and recently transitioned, separated out. And my brother also is serving in the Army currently and has recently returned from a deployment. In addition to the wonderful work that we've done and edited volume on the experiences of military affiliated learners in higher education classrooms, my dissertation also explored how former women service members perceive the military after they separate and the kind of relationships that are formed there. My background in public relations and strategic communication really seeks to provide a valuable lens for considering the role of employees as stakeholders in organizational decision-making. And I think we'll get into that a little bit later as we talk about readiness, recruitment, and morale in the military. Before we get started and jump into the kind of meat of our discussion here today, we want to acknowledge that we are going to be approaching this publication through a sort of loose podcasting format, which fits most with our collaborative ethos and seeks to provide opportunity for questions, answers, and dialogue. We also want to acknowledge that every service member's journey is unique and shaped by their own lived experiences serving in the armed forces. So we, as scholars and military dependents here today, want to recognize that and seek to discuss and give voice to the challenges and impacts of reproductive health access on service members and their families. Additionally, we honor gender as a complex social construct and frame pregnancy as a rich experience that impacts not only the individual, but their families, communities, and society at large. We will be using some generalizing terms throughout our discussion, such as the United States military or the military, recognizing that service members often sign up to serve their specific branch, and each branch has its own individual culture, norms, and expectations, and not the military writ large. We will also be using terms such as woman or women throughout our discussion, recognizing that many people outside of the construct of woman experience pregnancy. We use these terms as the language by the Department of Defense and the legal system both view gender as in line with biological sex in a binary framework. So to kick it to Dr. May, let's get started. And how did we get here?
Thank you, Tori. For many scholars, practitioners, and activists, there are 3 time periods that provide context to help us understand how we got here. The first time period is before Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade was decided in 1973, so that rich history that occurred before then. After Roe v. Wade, from 1973 to 2002, and post-Dobbs, this moment in time. Dobbs refers to the Supreme Court decision, Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, and it essentially overturned Roe v. Wade. By exploring the historical, social, and political context associated with each of these periods, we gain a deeper understanding of America's complex relationship and the military's complex relationship with abortion rights, women's rights, and reproductive freedoms. So let's start with this very first time period before Roe v. Wade. So before 1973, and we're going to travel all the way back to the 1850s. So during the 1850s, there was a lot happening. But up until this point, abortion wasn't illegal in the United States. Mary Thistle, in her book Vernacular Bodies, argues physicians drove the early anti-abortion movement. Specifically, the American Medical Association, or AMA, was in its infancy, and they were highly political. Thistle goes on to argue the American Medical Association was focused on gatekeeping the medical profession. Men in positions of power set policy that included or excluded who was deemed qualified to practice medicine. Prior to the AMA, midwives and other practitioners performed abortions, but the framing was radically different. It was focused on restoring menses, and it was deemed women's work. If we look at additional research from the American Society of Clinical Investigation, we have some additional information about what was happening in the 1850s. I mentioned the AMA was highly political at the time, and they wrote to lawmakers urging them to take action against unskilled providers, and this included women who were providing choice for pregnancy, and this ushered in the anti-abortion era in the United States. The AMA also supported the great white replacement conspiracies of the day, which argued if white women didn't have babies, whites would be replaced by Native Americans, Chinese, all of the immigrants that were coming into the country at the time, and this included the Catholics. We were a Protestant nation. Between 1860 and 1880, 44 anti-abortion laws were enacted, and we only had 33 states at the time. This demonstrated the power of the American Medical Association and their influence on politics, society, and ultimately what we have happening with post-Dobbs. Let me add, the AMA has since publicly acknowledged and apologized for its racist and sexist past, which directly contributed to systemic inequalities that continue to this day. There's a piece from 2021 that was written by the then Vice President, Dr. James Madera, where there was a further owning of the history and an affirmation of the organization's commitment to inclusion moving forward. So, women who did not want to continue with their pregnancies for many deeply personal reasons resorted to illegal abortions. These are commonly referred to as back alley abortions. They were done under unsanitary conditions by unskilled practitioners, which had the potential to result in death, infertility, and it contributed to the harm and collective trauma on women's bodies. So things started to change slowly as we moved through the decades, and then the 1950s hit, the 1950s hit, and something huge happened. Huge, huge, huge. Listeners, any guess? Tori and Leah, Loretta Lynn sang about it. Yes, we got the pill, and louder voices of disruptors arguing for reproductive rights in the form of the feminist movement settled in, and the stage was set for Roe. Now let's jump into the 60s. Jane Roe, we now know as Norma McCorvey, wanted an abortion, and this was happening in the state of Texas. At this time, 44 states had strict abortion bans in place, but there were no medical risks associated with her pregnancy, so she had two choices. One, have a baby, or risk an illegal abortion, and as we discussed previously, was just not safe. So she did have the baby, and she placed it up for adoption. But a group of lawyers at this time were looking for a case to challenge state abortion laws. And they heard about Jane and decided this would be their moment. This would be the case. So they sued the district attorney in Texas, and it ended up all the way up in the Supreme Court. So I want you to picture this. It's 1971. There's 11 justices on the Supreme Court at this time, all seasoned all seasoned litigators and judges, all men, and this 28-year-old attorney, Sarah Weddington, stands up in front of the court and argues that abortion laws in Texas are unconstitutional and that they violated the First, the Fourth, the Fifth, the Ninth, and the 14th Amendments of the U.S. Constitution. And we are talking about the collections of rights for privacy protections, personal liberties, due process under the law. So in 1973, the Supreme Court issued their decision and changed the law of the land in a 7-2 vote. It was affirmed abortion is a choice up to a point. We did have the third trimester restrictions, and it was based on the right to privacy contained in the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. So since the moment the verdict came down in Roe, states have consistently challenged the federal government's control of abortion rights, which ultimately gets us to Dobbs and further constitutional debates, as this decision was perceived as directly challenging state sovereignty. So before we get to Dobbs, I want to mention one other case, and it's referenced in the Dobbs decision, and gives us some additional context. So Planned Parenthood of Southeastern Pennsylvania versus Casey, known as the Casey decision. This is 1992. And in this case, the Supreme Court further diminished state sovereignty, so the argument goes, by prohibiting states from passing laws that create an undue burden on a woman's right to have an abortion, and it also weakened the third trimester restrictions. Important to keep that in mind. So now let's go to Dobbs, and let's go to that final time period, and let's try to figure out what was happening. So at the center of Dobbs is the 10th Amendment. So the 10th Amendment of the Constitution underscores state sovereignty. It is sacrosanct, and the court has consistently been hesitant to supersede state rights. And Dobbs became the ultimate test of this. So at the center of Dobbs is a Mississippi law. It's the Mississippi Gestational Age Act, which banned abortions past 15 weeks, except in rare situations. But if we think back to Roe, abortion is a choice until a fetus is viable. And in Casey, we had weakening of that third trimester restriction and that emphasis on the undue burden of a woman's right to access abortion. So ultimately, this was the center of the debate. And in a 6-3 split, the court upheld the Mississippi law and restored state sovereignty. So let me share an excerpt from the ruling from Justice Alito, which sums this up. The Constitution makes no reference to abortion, and no such right is implicitly protected by any constitutional provision, including the one of which the defenders of Roe and Casey now chiefly rely, the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. That's it. Dramatic pause. That's the moment. So that was in 2022, and we are in a historical, unprecedented time, and we're trying to understand what this means for all of us. And our focus here today is on military service members, so let's make that connection. Before 1970, women who became pregnant could no longer serve. They were discharged from the military. So two choices, either leave the military or risk an evil abortion, which was just not safe. And there was one case that changed this, and I just want to highlight this because it was famously argued by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and the case is Strzok versus the Secretary of Defense. Strzok was an Air Force serviceman who wanted an abortion, but she lived in a state with abortion banned. And at this time, only a few states allowed abortion. So she fought this, and she was transferred to Washington State, where she was able to have an abortion. But this case ultimately changed DOD policies for service members experiencing pregnancy. So since then, service members and their access to abortion has been defined by each White House administration. The American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, provides a detailed overview of all of the historical points, and it's just a back and forth. You get whiplash. So Nixon said military installations had to follow state laws. So some states allowed it, some states didn't. So there was unequal protection for service members experiencing pregnancy. Bush in 1988 outright banned it. Clinton reversed it. The Senate reinstated it in 1995. And Lee is going to add some additional context to this with her discussion of the Hyde Amendment. So today, more and more states are passing legislation to restrict access to abortion. Military One Source, which is from the Department of Defense, lists 405 military installations in the continental U.S. and Puerto Rico. And this includes the Air Force, the Army, Defense Logistics Agency, the Marine Corps, the National Guard, the Navy, and Space Force. Of those 405, roughly 20% are in states with outright bans. This restricts choice and access to abortion and places an undue burden on military service members and their families. So to get deeper into what this means for service members and their families, I turn it over to Leah.
Awesome. Thank you, Amy, for that important legal context that Tori and I most certainly would not have wanted to give ourselves. So in thinking about the significance of Roe v. Wade on reproductive freedoms, put quite simply, the overturning of Roe v. Wade is a grave instance of reproductive injustice. And this is for communities across the country, not just military service members. So as Tori, Amy, and I have discussed in an earlier article that we published in the journal Women in Language, When we first heard about the overturn of Roe v. Wade, we three who have been friends for years, gender studies, feminist studies scholars, and also military dependents, we immediately started wondering about what would be the impact in this context for our friends and our family members who are serving, for our students who are still tethered to the military in a variety of ways, and also for the service members who are going to come and continue joining in the future, as Tori will talk about a little bit in her section. So what I'll talk about right now includes an overview of reproductive justice and homeland maternity, two frameworks or concepts that are particularly helpful for our discussion. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the health issues and restrictions that service members continue to face in the aftermath of the overturn. So as Dr. Sarah de los Santos Upton and I have noted in previous research, reproductive justice as a framework helps inform how we understand justice and injustice in reproductive context, as well as the power of collective solidarity, resistance, and activism. And the reason I want to be very forthcoming about that is because the last thing I would ever want us to do is to say that we are in a dystopian hellscape, we have no solutions, and this is it, because that is not the case. History has shown us time and time again that when things get rough, we band together, we organize, and we fight back. And this is exactly part of the underlying ethos that is driving our conversation here. So in my book with Dr. Sarah de los Santos Upton, which is entitled Challenging Reproductive Control and Gendered Violence in the Americas, Intersectionality, Power, and Struggles for Rights, we first explain the historical overview of reproductive justice accordingly, namely that it was first created and defined by 12 U.S. Black feminists in 1994 at a Chicago convention. And it is so important here to think about the relationship between reproductive justice and intersectionality, and to honor the Black feminists and the Black scholars before us who have created these frameworks for us and for others. So if you haven't heard of Sister Song, by all means, go and check it out. It talks of the framing and the founding of reproductive justice and some of the contemporary efforts going on now. And as the organization explains on its website, these Black feminists recognize that the women's rights movement could not defend the needs of women of color and other marginalized women and trans communities as well. And if you don't know about the deep dives of the history of the women's movement, especially in the United States, let us just say that the 1960s, as we know, during second wave feminism, was a time of intense activism and also intense splintering, mostly because the women's rights movement at the time was largely led by middle class and upper class wealthy white women who did not necessarily see other women communities of color on the same page when it came to reproductive freedoms and reproductive rights. So the website further says, we needed to lead our own national movement to uplift the needs of the most marginalized women, families, and communities, end quote. So the women named themselves Women of African Descent for Reproductive Justice, and thus the reproductive justice framework was born. It includes three fundamental pillars. One, the right to have a child. Two, the right to not have a child. And three, the right to parent children in safe and healthy environments. And reproductive justice is rooted in the power of autonomy and agency. What it does is it blends older reproductive rights frameworks with a framework of social justice to create a more expansive approach to reproductive rights and health across the lifespan. And Sarah and I also talked about this in our book, but it helps us go so far beyond the pro-choice, pro-life binary, right? As we know, reproductive health is not just about abortion only, but it's about the prenatal, the natal, the postnatal care, and the healthcare across the lifespan, including but not limited to sexual health education, contraception, policies that support service members to make these decisions in a self-determined and actualized manner, and on and on. Ultimately, it views reproductive healthcare, access, and justice as a fundamental human right, which helps connect us back to Amy's conversations earlier. Another important concept here that is helpful for our purposes is that of homeland maternity, which was developed by Natalie Fixmer-Orraiz, that explores how motherhood is constantly a site of intense contestation, particularly when thinking about surveillance and policing and restrictions. And again, if we're thinking about it across a lifespan, we can now think about conversations we're having about menstruation tracking apps and several other ways that we are seeing our privacy being undermined, essentially. So Natalie Fixmer-Orais goes on to note that we are facing stunning hostility to sexual and reproductive self-determination, particularly when we are seeing efforts to remove maternal dignity, reproductive access, and respect to bodily autonomy. And that's exactly what we're seeing here with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, which highlights how the policing of pregnancy is intertwined with the Homeland Security state and other forces and structures. And as we know, for minoritized communities serving in the US military, women, transgender, non-binary communities, and the like, their bodies are not only regulated by restrictive civilian practices, but also military gender politics and practices as well. And as several scholars have noted, for the military, the overturning of Roe v. Wade is a matter of national security, which Tori is going to talk about next in her section as we think about morale, readiness, and the like. So to give us an idea here of the current landscape of service members in the U.S. military, according to a 2022 Department of Defense brief, while the number of service members dropped almost 3% in recent years, the number of women service members is slightly increasing, and that is on the uptick as well. Women serve, as we know, at all levels across all branches in all military occupational specialties, or MOSs, as we collectively refer to them as. However, they continue to face significant gendered and racialized barriers, as well as others, which are also compounded when you think about the diversity of identity experiences. Collectively as well, women service members are often judged by their reproductive decisions, such as being accused of getting pregnant to intentionally avoid a deployment, for example. And like I mentioned earlier, I have spent so many years working primarily with active duty service members who were college students. And this was a story that I heard time and time again. Several of my women students said that they were terrified to get pregnant. They were terrified to talk about it. They were worried that they wouldn't get promoted. They were worried that they would get negative evaluations that would then impact their promotions and their careers, and on and on and on. So going back to Natalie Fixmer-Orais's point, it is highly, highly contested. And when you think about the intersection of reproductive justice or injustice and gender violence, we can see how the situation becomes more dire, particularly because women service members are more likely to have an unintended pregnancy, miscarriage, or ectopic pregnancy than their civilian peers. They're more likely to experience intimate partner violence and be sexually assaulted, which could further heighten risk for unintended pregnancies. And then, like Amy mentioned earlier, what further compounds all of this is the Hyde Amendment, which is federal legislation that blocks the use of federal funds for an abortion, unless it is a result of rape or it threatens the life of the individual. So under the Hyde Amendment, individuals in the U.S. military cannot receive an abortion procedure on base unless it meets one of these levels. And again, when we think about the complex nature of serving in the military with the chain of command, multiple reporting levels, and then all of the other discussions swirling the Vanessa Guillen case, which Tori will talk about in a little bit, we can see how for service members, the decision to get an abortion is not just about getting an abortion at all. It is about navigating all of these complex systems and structures that makes it incredibly challenging. So ultimately, the overturning of Roe v. Wade has significant implications for service members and reproductive justice in the military, such as the potential for cultural backlash, continued surveillance and control, stigma, privacy concerns, and also continued concerns about recruitment and retention. And one of the main takeaways here that I want us to keep in mind is, again, the overturning of Roe v. Wade is about abortion, but it's also about so much more. And collectively, we continue to assert that we have to contextualize it within the larger constellation of reproductive access and justice and gender violence, because the overturning of Roe v. Wade is about so much more than abortion rights, but it signals a loss of bodily autonomy, bodily rights, and as Natalie Fixmer-Orais notes, the capacity to even fight for those rights at all. So Tori, tell us more about retention, readiness, and morale.
Yes. So thank you both for covering both, the legal repercussions and ramifications of the overturning of Roe v. Wade and the injustice of the loss of reproductive rights, which really now brings us to current and the current and future military readiness of our country. And you might have heard this term military readiness thrown around. As defined by the Department of Defense, this is the ability of military forces to fight and meet the demands of an assigned mission. A little bit vague, but in a 2020 Congressional Research Service report on the fundamentals of military readiness, it's really built around 3 pillars: building initial readiness, increasing readiness, and sustaining readiness, of which recruitment and retention is crucial in all 3 pillars. So understanding the communicative considerations and the impact of federal decisions on the culture of the military and military readiness today is important, as point blank, the military has a recruiting and readiness issue, which Leah spoke about a little bit earlier. And in 2022, the US Department of Defense actually began documenting and really discussing the military recruiting crisis, although actually nearly all of the DoD Inspector General's top management and performance challenges reports starting back from 2016 really started raising concerns about building the future of the force and increasing military readiness. So 2025 actually marks the 4th consecutive year of recruiting challenges for the military. And I do want to kind of caveat that in fiscal year 2024, recruitment rose 12.5%. However, a piece published by the Georgetown Security Studies Review states that recruitment is still an ongoing challenge and is likely to worsen as the administration continues to reshape the military. There are a variety of factors that might impact a person's decision to join and stay in the military. And of course, some of these decisions are going to be personal and unique to each individual service member, but research has identified that there are some overarching trends in decision-making practices. So, for example, some researchers have documented what has been dubbed a warrior caste or legacy recruits, in which we increasingly rely on a small group of multi-generational families to fight America's wars. And thus, proximity to the military and military members plays a significant role in people's decision to join the military. In addition to proximity, those who have served more recently are actually less likely to recommend military service. So although folks might nowadays have access to military members, they're less likely to actually recommend military service to young folks, as the Edelman Trust Barometer, an organization that monitors trust globally in organizations, has documented a significant decline in trust in institutions, kind of built around a lot of different factors such as mis and disinformation, political polarization, and discrepancies in meeting expectations. Some additional challenges to recruitment include actually meeting eligibility requirements to serve. And the U.S. Army Recruiting Command in 2024 showed that less than 30% of America's youth are qualified for military service due to a variety of physical and academic deficiencies, and that is their language on their website. Moreover, rates of sexual assault and violence in the military, which are higher against women, can significantly deter individuals from deciding to join or stay in the military if little to no action is taken. I think it's important to note that there are a variety of ways that a case can go unreported, that reports may not be escalated through proper channels, that commands and people in positions of power can impact what happens with reports. As an independent review of data of the DoD's estimates of sexual assault and violence in the military estimate that's actually probably 10 times higher than what's currently being reported. So pretty prevalent in this kind of culture. And I think the Vanessa Guillon case in Fort Hood really demonstrates the kind of ultimate end that can happen to women in the military, and that is death after experiencing sexual assault and violence. So there are very real threats and pressure for women serving in the military that we have to take into consideration. And lastly, the chaos and the harmful language of the current Trump administration may continue to negatively impact future recruitment and retention of service members, as key programs for active duty and veteran service members are poised to be gutted, such as the planning of slashing 83,000 jobs from the Veterans Affairs Department, to the ending of the VA Home Loan Assistance Program, to demanding the removal of transgender service members and their benefits, and further damage on the horizon, such as the Secretary of Defense stating that they might scrap sexual assault and prevention programs across all branches. So you might ask, how does this kind of perfect storm come together to impact military readiness in the context of Roe v. Wade? Well, women's experiences and expectations of rights, such as reproductive self-determination, may significantly impact their decision to continue, join, and stay in the military. And women have always played a pivotal role in the military, often without recognition. Notably, we mentioned a few times throughout our discussion here today that there has been some uptick in current recruitment. And where do we think that recruitment came from? Well, actually, in 2024, women helped drive the Army's success of recruiting its 2024 recruitment goals with an 18% jump in women signing up for active duty service. And this totals nearly 10,000 women who enlisted in 2024. And according to a trend report by military.com, which is kind of a website that often talks about military culture and challenges within the military, this is in line with data showing that the Army's recruiting slump has actually been centered around men, and that female recruiting numbers have remained very strong. They also point to young women as increasingly vital, as young men struggle to meet the Army's eligibility requirements, as women are less likely to have criminal records, and they're outpacing men in education, according to data from Pew Research in late 2024. However, many women must often make the difficult decision between military service and parenthood, as they are often all-encompassing, very dichotomous identities that take place around the same age range. Now, outside of meeting recruiting numbers, women have long served in vital roles in military conflicts. From serving in non-combat roles, such as medical writers, to logistics and intelligence officers, to now serving in combat positions, women have and continue to be integral to the American success in war. And the American Legion and the United States Services Organization, or USO, respectively, provide very succinct timelines of the over 200-year history of women serving in American combat. In my dissertation specifically, I interviewed 30 former active duty service members, and they really talked about experiencing very similar combat situations to their male counterparts, even before being allowed into combat roles starting in 2016, as they lived during Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Iraqi Freedom on the same forward operating bases, or FOBs. They worked in the hospitals and in logistics that were receiving enemy fire, and drove in the tanks that also took potential enemy fire. So they're often experiencing very similar or the same combat as their male counterparts, often without the recognition and support when they came home. And research on these operations has actually shown that women played a crucial role in both combat and non-combat efforts, and actually shaped the outcomes of these conflicts through their intelligence gathering, medical aid, and through their combat service support. For example, military service members played crucial roles in connecting with communities and building trust, especially with their ability to access and go into women-only spaces during the war to gain crucial intelligence. And as argued by Greenberg in 2023, the gendered work of war, despite official military policy, all female teams were often on the front lines of post-9/11 wars, whether we maybe knew it or not. And they did this all while facing sexual harassment and assault, having ill-fitting gear, and dealing with policies built and geared towards the lives of their male counterparts in relation to parenthood and the decision to parent. So as Leah mentioned earlier, we've been in these situations before, and we've come out stronger, and we've made the best of it, right? So finally, with high rates of sexual assault and violence against women serving in the military, self-determined reproductive freedom is so important so that women can make the choices that they need to make to best support themselves in worst case scenarios. Overall, 30 years of scientific and organizational communication research clearly demonstrate that diverse teams, cognitively, identity-based, experience-based, are better at solving complex problems when compared to more homogeneous teams, even if they have top performers. And as stated by the Secretary of the Army, Eric Fanning, in 2016, America's diversity is our Army's strength. Ultimately, the continued denial of reproductive self-determination and autonomy for women service members, in conjunction with the current rhetorical and visual messaging from the current administration related to the reshaping of America's legal and military systems, paints a very clear message. The United States military is underprepared to meet the readiness needs of its women service members. And Amy, I'll kick it back to you.
Thank you, Tori. Thank you, Leah, for such rich discussion. I always learn so much when we're together. Ultimately, there are more questions than answers, so we'll close by thinking about future research and directions that we're headed. For me, I'm looking closely and following litigation, especially in the southern states on the East Coast. So we're talking Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, as legal challenges to state abortion laws work their way through the system. Many of the cases challenge state constitutions, and one in particular, which really underscores the importance of Sister Song, as Leah was discussing earlier, is the state of Georgia versus Sister Strong Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective. Ultimately, will one of these cases working its way through the system allow us to challenge Dobbs? And then finally, while our focus is on the constitutionality of abortion bans and the impact on female or service members, we don't know the full extent of the Dobbs decision in terms of its aftermath and consequences. So existing disparities in terms of access to healthcare may continue to impact marginalized communities. And in the dissenting opinion of Dobbs, Sotomayor, Breyer, and Kagan warned this decision has far-reaching consequences which may infringe on rights to contraception, sexual intimacy, who you can marry, and we just don't know. Leah, what are you thinking?
Yeah, thank you for that, Amy. I keep thinking about the necessity for continued and also stronger, more impactful advocacy, collaborative building, and networking, right? So we have so many of us doing similar work in similar spaces, right? Military studies, military communication studies, health communication, gender studies, and on and on and on. But what I want to see more of is more intentional conversations among scholars inside and outside of our field, as well as more conversations with local and national military research organizations who are also trying to advocate on behalf of our service members as best as we can, right? We're communication scholars. We know how to do this kind of work. I think now it's time for us to really be intentional about how to be more forward-facing and more involved in these democratic processes to try to impact military health policies as best we can to ensure that we can help service members have access to the full range of reproductive health care that they need across their lifespan, especially for those who are serving 20 years plus and making the career or making the military a career. Yeah, Tori, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I'm thinking similarly along those lines. I heard recently like a quote about how they're really trying to change culture through policy and how that kind of top-down decision making probably won't play out maybe in the ways that they think it will. And so I'm really interested to see the kind of impacts on culture because, you know, for a long time, the military was critiqued for being a very hegemonically masculine kind of space. And then the pendulum kind of swung the opposite direction. And we heard terms thrown around like woke, the woke military. And so I'm really interested to see where this is going to kind of lead us. And I know some scholars and service members in different media spaces have also talked about, what points do service members have to say we follow the Constitution and not a singular person. So I'm really interested, I think, to see kind of how all this plays out. I think, as Amy mentioned, we just don't know. And there's a lot of scholarship, advocacy, and work to be done.
Thank you, Leah. Thank you, Tori. For everyone who's joining us, thank you so much for being part of the discussion today. We will continue to move forward together and support each other through these uncertain times. Thank you, everyone.